start off looking at some older video games, probably ones that aren't seen often. As is the case with cinema and film, the development of video games has closely paralleled the development of technology. As faster computers and better sound cards, better video cards have come along that allow better graphics, the games have become more realistic. They've become easier to relate to, just as color television or color film is more vivid, more realistic than is black and white film. We've been looking at an arcade game put out in 1975 called Gunfight. We can see even back then the game would kind of let the player step inside an old western and take part in a shootout, participate in sort of an alternate reality. This game illustrates that from the beginning, video games have tried to mimic reality, have tried to let the user take part in something they otherwise couldn't. The next type of video games we're going to look at is what are called vector games. This was sort of the first innovation in video gaming. Essentially, it is just drawing with lines. One of the most famous examples of this type of game is a game called Battlezone, put out by Atari in 1980. Even though things are a little sparse, it's still fairly convincing 3D environment. You can see the moon in the background and the mountains that never change, but all of these closer objects move as we do. This game was so realistic and so innovative that the U.S. Army actually commissioned Atari to create a version of the game that they could use for their infantry vehicle training. You can also see in the background that volcano going off, just a nice little touch that doesn't have anything to do with gameplay, but just makes things a little more realistic. Next up is a game called Star Trek, made in 1982. This was after the popular television series back in the late 60s and after the release of the first movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture, in 1980. So already we have a video game that is based off of film. Again, it uses the same technology, using only lines to represent shapes. Another very similar game that came out a year later and used the same vector technology was Star Wars in 1983, after the release of the first and second episodes of that film. And that video game actually featured audio clips taken directly from the movie. It let the player play the part of Luke and destroy the Death Star. The next type of game we're going to look at in the next real development, back probably in the mid-1980s, is what was called Raster games. These are games that, instead of using wires to sort of represent a universe, used a lot of flat pictures called sprites that had been hand-drawn for the most part. One of the most popular Raster games when it first came out was Street Fighter, made by Capcom in 1991. These games were just a series of pictures, again drawn just by a cartoonist, and sort of laid one over another in kind of the same way you would just a cartoon. These games were made more feasible because now developers were able to store a lot more memory, to have a lot more memory available to them to store their images on. Street Fighter II ruled the roost until in 1992, Midway came out with the brand new technology. Instead of having artists draw characters, in Mortal Kombat for the first time, there were digital stills of actual actors. They had actors stand using a green screen, and they'd take pictures of them in various poses and then map them to the game in the appropriate places. It's also interesting to note the blood that the blood and the violence in this game that had a lot of people concerned when it first came out. The the makers of the game were aware of this concern, and they actually put switches on the back of the arcade machines that did nothing, it turned out, but they told people when they first were marketing the arcade that these switches would turn up or down the levels of violence. The appeal for a lot of people of this game was just how realistic it looked. It looked like there were real people fighting, and that you were really controlling one of these people in this phony world, this virtual world. Another video game that used this same technology by the same company was a game called Narc, where the player was a narcotics officer out busting the bad guys. And again, they used real actors who posed, and then they put their images in the game. This made things a lot more realistic than was possible with using only cartoons. The last kind of type of game we're going to look at is what's most popular today, where technology has left us. That's 3D games. Of course, there's a great deal of overlap between these technologies. And the first attempts to make a three-dimensional game were, back in the 80s, back with Battlezone. But it wasn't a truly three-dimensional environment in the sense that the tank couldn't move up and down. It could only move backwards and forwards and left and right. Here's an example of another game called Rescue, put out in 1989 by Kemco, that tried to make a three-dimensional environment without really being a truly three-dimensional environment. There's something to be said for sound effects. On the left of the screen, you can see sort of a map of this building he's in, sort of a bird's eye view, and this player is represented by that little red arrow. I'm not sure if you can make that out, but he's walking around, and with each move he makes, there's a new picture in front of him. Sort of a three-dimensional environment, even though it's designed to look like a three-dimensional environment. Of course, it's really just a cartoon that's been drawn. But this is the sort of game that made way for further development in 3 dimensions. What's viewed by a lot of people as the granddaddy of 3D video games is this game, Wolfenstein 3D. You just saw that PG-13 rating that they voluntarily placed at the beginning of the game. This game gives a very realistic rendering of the walls and the floor and doors. A real feeling of being there in the first person. I want you to pay attention to this table here. We'll see how it's not a truly three-dimensional game, at least not fully. It's what's called a 2.5D, 2.5 dimensions. The chairs at this table are always behind the table, no matter what side of the table you stand on. And that's because there's just one picture. It's just a flat picture of this table, and no matter where you stand in the room, it always looks the same. So in this sense, the table is not three-dimensional. Another example of this same sort of thing is this little sort of cross-looking treasure straight ahead. No matter where we stand in the room, it always looks the same. It's always facing us. Just like the rest of the objects in the room, the trees and those little goblets, and again the table and the lamps, they always look the same no matter where we stand. But it's important to keep in mind that at the time these things were amazing. I mean, having the walls three-dimensional was a brand new thing. It had never been done, and so even though there were some things that weren't quite realistic, it more than made up for it with the 3D graphics, or rather what gave the appearance of 3 dimensions. One last thing we'll consider is sort of the interaction of objects. There's a vase here we can see, and no matter what we try and do, we can't interact with it. It is just part of the game, part of the environment. We can't affect it. We will see some examples of this in other games. You might argue that the more interactive the environment is, the more you are able to interact with things, the more realistic it is. In 1993, from the same company, id Software, you have a game called Doom. Same concept as in Wolfenstein 3D, basically go around and kill as many people as you can. But this time, an even more realistic three-dimensional environment. In Wolfenstein, you couldn't, there was no horizontal movement. You couldn't go upstairs or downstairs. There was only straight ahead. Also here, as we saw, you can interact with the environment a little more, shooting those barrels. The objects, once again, like these little helmets we're picking up, are two-dimensional. They're just sprites, just like were used in Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, just pictures that are placed there, and no matter where we stand to look at them, they look exactly the same. This little red corpse, for example, no matter how we move around it, it's always facing us in the same way. Another enhancement over Wolfenstein on the feel and play of the game is how the player, when he walks, sort of bounces and the gun moves. It just makes things look feel a little more real. Also in Doom, we get away from the sort of the square environment. In Wolfenstein, everything was at right angles with each other, but here we have curved stairs, slants, things that are a little more tricky to do, but certainly make things more realistic. Before we move on to the last game, just a little demonstration about sort of where we've come so far. This is a drawing, just a framework of a ship, a little spaceship, sort of similar to the vector games that we looked at earlier. But now with faster processors, we are able to sort of paint between the lines and make this object that looks three-dimensional. Also, kind of where technology is now, in addition to painting between the lines, we can take images and actually put the images sort of between the lines. So here we have this image we've taken and just mapped it to a cube that we're able to move about in all 3 dimensions. We can stretch it, and with more advanced computers we can make the lighting on it different and whatnot. So that's how the effects in today's games are made possible. Keep in mind as you watch the intro to this next game that none of these pictures are made with the camera. This is all generated by the computer using the technology we just talked about. So this is a game that came out in 2001. One of the key differences in this game is that everything is three-dimensional. From your player, that little fountain sitting over there, everything really takes up space in this environment, unlike the table in Wolfenstein. Also, in this game, instead of just a bunch of senseless violence or in addition to a bunch of senseless violence,
showed what was left of the inner circle.
there's a sort of a story, a plot line.
On screen, the so-called corpse of Alfred Woden stood up, miraculously waking from his dirt nap, looking smug among his dead pals.
Now and then, as you're moving around the levels, these sort of comic strip storylines come up and just carry on the narration of what's going on and who you're looking for and what you're trying to do, adding to the feel that you really are in this reality. The environment in Max Payne is very interactive. Pretty much if you can think of doing it, you can do it. This desk, for example, we've got this monitor here, and in a real world, if you took a baseball bat to a monitor, it would kind of explode like that. Here again are some more examples of interacting with the environment. These things have absolutely nothing to do with winning or losing the game. Same thing with this vending machine. If you put in a quarter, out comes a can, but it's not at all part of the plot. You can turn this sink on. These things kind of add to the feeling of really being there. They're a good measure of how well a game is able to convince you that you are part of this environment. From start to finish, this game has a very cinematic feel. Feels like you're really part of a movie.
Outside the city was a cruel monster. I've been slowly working my way from the small time to the big fish, trying to get to the source of the drug. Alex and BB were
You kind of feel like you're part of this plot that's just unfolding before your eyes, and half the time it doesn't seem like you are actually playing a video game, but rather you're just watching this movie. There's a lot of camera movement that mirrors what is done in film. This shot here sort of sets up what's going on outside. It's snowing, and Max is down in the subway here, riding below. We get a nice long shot here of him hopping out of the subway. Right here, that sort of sets up the environment for us, and this is where we take over. Occasionally, even during gameplay, the camera will move off of Max and go to one of the bigger bad guys he has just killed. Making things just a little more realistic. Max Payne also sort of steals a page out of the Matrix's book of tricks and lets the player push a special button, and everything kind of goes slow-mo, and you're able to aim a little better, and it just looks, it's a very, very handsome graphic. Easier to accomplish in a video game than in the real world. All of these things, the storyline, the graphics, the gameplay, the interaction with the environment, they all lend themselves to a feeling of just being at the movies, of watching this, sort of making your own movie, I guess. You control the main character. So in a little over 25 years, we've gone from the game Gunfight to Maxwell Payne. We've gone from a very simple game to a very complex game with complex plot, graphics, interaction, gameplay, you name it. Very realistic and certainly very movie-like.